I'm Sebastian. I'm a certified technical architect and the founder of Flow Republic, the elite Salesforce Academy. You might have heard about us. We've been coaching many CTAs successfully and help them pass their exam. We are trusted by individuals and offer academy programs for leading and established Salesforce partners such as Cognizant, Deloitte, IBM, PwC, Silverline, and many others. And this year has been really big for us. We just had 2 additional CTAs joining our team of coaches. And we're truly excited to announce many more offerings coming that will help you and other trailblazers to really unlock their true potential. Today, we are announcing our communication bootcamp that will really help you to boost your communication skills and blaze your trail to success.
Thanks to everyone that's joining from all over the world. So I'm really excited to talk about one of my my favorite topics around the transitioning path from a developer to an architect. So I'm certainly stoked to talk about that today. My name is Jan Spott. I am based in sunny Sydney. It's 8 p.m. in Sydney. Today, I am a certified technical architect. I passed my exam about 2 years ago. I am running a Salesforce and MuleSoft consulting firm called Jarvis. We are very new, and it's a very exciting journey that we're on at the moment. And at the same time, I'm helping my friend Sebastian, who runs a CTA coaching program, to teach the next generation of certified technical architects. So what's in it today for you? First of all, I want to make sure that we have a good understanding around what is an architect versus a developer. So that we're really clear on sort of like where I draw the line between the 2 different roles and where I see the responsibilities of each of those roles. I also want to bust a few myths that are out there around architects. Then, as I promised in my session topic, we will look at 9 considerations that I think are important if you are a developer today and you want to become an architect. And then we finish with a summary, or probably better, an action plan, so that you leave here with a tool set ready to go to start your journey. Let's get into it. Salesforce architects versus developers. So first of all, let's dive into a developer role, right? And by the way, like if there are the different seniorities that you have in a developer role, certainly change a little bit on what you would do here. But I've just classified it as developers and architects. First of all, I think a developer focuses on solving a specific problem. And what I mean by that is that we're not looking at the big picture. We really have a specific problem that we're trying to solve. And that could be as simple as create a bunch of records if a certain condition is met on a child record. It could be stuff like writing a Lightning web component that visualizes a certain element of data, right? You're solving a specific problem. Next, I think a developer is in charge of developing the product. So you are the executing entity that brings the product to life. You haven't done the overarching design for that. You haven't done the data model, but you're the person that is in charge of making sure that what was described in the specification works at the end. Certainly, Salesforce developers are proficient in either Apex and or Lightning, right? Now we'll talk a bit more about if you need to know both languages or if one is enough. I'll talk to that in a bit. I think as a developer, you are in charge of designing the code structure. And I want to be very specific here. For me, it's not enough to just get it to work, right? Just writing an Apex trigger that calls a handler class and that inserts a bunch of records is probably not enough to be a good developer. I think as a good developer, and that's what I mean like with rising seniority, I certainly would expect developers to think about polymorphism, frameworks, patterns, right? Think of things like dependency injection, composition versus inheritance, right? Core principles within software development that especially in senior principal developer roles, I expect people to think about that. Obviously, as a developer, you are in charge of designing and writing tests. So that means positive tests, negative tests, right? Unit tests, all that kind of stuff is normally within your remit. And I guess most organizations expect you that a feature is not complete unless it's been tested. I think quite often as a developer, you're responsible for CI/CD, even though That's not always the case, but I think as a developer, you naturally are drawn to be quite good in CI/CD because you are using SFTX, for example, to pull code out of your org. You understand branching. So CI/CD sort of like is the natural evolution of your knowledge already. As a developer, you identify areas for modification existing code, right? Think about cleaning up technical debt. You are looking at existing code to extend it, to make it more reusable, to maybe create a framework off the back of that. That's all a developer task. And lastly, you do consider governor limits when you design your solution, right? We're lucky in Salesforce that we have governor limits, which makes it really easy for us to write code. So what does an architect then do, right? Because it sounds like a lot what a developer does. Well, as an architect, I think you think just bigger, right? First of all, you hold the vision and you foresee the system before it's built. And what I mean by that is that the vision means what are you trying to achieve end to end, right? There might be 20 or 30 or 50 different developer tasks that all need to solve a specific problem. But as an architect, you hold the oversight for all of that, right? We implement Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, and Community Cloud, right? There will be maybe 3 different teams working on each of those clouds. As an architect, you are in charge of keeping track of all of that. You're certainly concerned with the bigger picture. And when I talk about the bigger picture, I'm not just talking about Salesforce, right? I'm talking about things like integration options, other systems. I'm talking about identity management, data volumes, sharing, right? So like a lot of big areas that as an architect, you certainly need to consider. And when I talk about those big areas, right, I want to give you a few examples. So if you are as a Salesforce architect on a project, I think quite often what happens is that you're an elevated developer and you're essentially still writing code, which by the way is totally acceptable. But I think the key area that I want architects to work on is to make sure they document considerations, right? We are building this solution and we've made this decision for that specific solution because of that, right? As an architect, I fully expect them to be able to justify and explain why they have made a certain decision, right? And I think it's a very important thing that as an architect, you can articulate this and articulate it for all of those areas that I've mentioned, right? Can you articulate why you built this ERD in this way? Can you articulate why you've chosen an orchestration layer that is, let's say, event-driven as your middleware solution? Can you explain why you are not using an ETL tool and you're using MuleSoft instead? Where does your master data live, right? All those areas are questions that I would expect an architect to be able to answer. Now, regardless if you're an architect or a developer, you are important. And I genuinely believe this because both roles, as I've just described, are very distinct in their responsibilities. And I can be the best architect in the world if I don't have great developers that can realize that vision that I'm creating and that I'm shaping with the customer. My architecture can be the best in the world, but it will just not be a great product, right? The other way around as well. You can be the best developer in the world that writes the most beautiful code that's fully reusable and thought through, etc. But if it's not addressing the vision and the end goal, and it doesn't integrate with our solutions, we've missed the mark, right? So wherever you are on your journey, I think you are extremely important. So please keep that in mind. And one of the things that I also want to call out here is that I think we always look at the natural progression of the developer is you become an architect. And I don't think that's necessarily true because not all developers will make fantastic architects, and that's totally okay, right? Because an architect, you need to bring other skill sets to the party around workshopping, etc. And we talk about that in a second. But the way how we, for example, run it within my business is that we have 2 tracks, right? You sort of like start as a developer and you make it a senior developer, and then you have the option to go either way. You can say, okay, I want to stay on the developer track and I become a principal developer, or I want to move rather into the architecture domain and want to become an architect. And for me, it's totally acceptable if somebody says, hey, I want to stay as a developer. This is what I like and this is what I want to do. Right? So I think it's just important to be aware that that is also an option. So what are some of the common myths that are out there? Salesforce architects must be able to code. I genuinely do not believe that this is true. However, if you can code as an architect, it's just gonna be easier, right? And because so many people are coming from a developer background and make it into Salesforce architects, for them it's a no-brainer. But if you are an enterprise architect that migrates from a different enterprise architecture domain into the Salesforce ecosystem, it's unlikely that you know how to write Apex or Lightning Web Components, right? JavaScript. So, and I don't think that you need to know that in order to be successful, because again, like as the architect, like if you're coming across as an experienced architect, you already designed data models, you face the same concerns that you would face as a Salesforce architect around performance, around where does the data live, how is it integrated, etc. Right? The second myth, I think, are certifications are the golden standard. Don't get me wrong, certifications are extremely important and they validate your knowledge. And I certainly encourage everybody to get as many certifications as they can, right? It just proves that you know what you're talking about. However, if I weigh off experience versus certification, the experience always outweighs the certifications that you have, because let's face it, after all, to get a Salesforce certification, you pass a multiple choice test. And if you try that often enough, you will eventually pass, right? It's going to be hard, no question, but like you will eventually pass. Experience, in my eyes, is so much more important, because if you have implemented Service Cloud, Sales Cloud, Community Cloud, the likelihood of you passing that exam is so much greater already that the certification is essentially just a validation of your knowledge, rather than you study to pass a certification and then you need to get the experience. Salesforce developers must be able to write Apex and Lightning Web Components. I think the full stack developer in the Salesforce ecosystem was a thing until Lightning came out, right? When it was just Apex and Visual Force, developers were expected to essentially write Apex and Visual Force. However, now with Lightning Web Components being on an entirely different technology stack, it's all JavaScript, it's event-driven, it's component-based, right? It's very different to the skill set that we have as a backend developer. And for that reason, I don't think that as a Salesforce developer, you must be able to write both. I think I would value it more if you know one of the areas really well, rather than both not as well, if that makes sense. Next one, CTAs know everything. That's just not true, right? Like we are learning like everybody else, and yes, we had to study a lot of the Salesforce platform in order to pass our review board, but it does not mean that we know everything. And I quite commonly face that, where people ask me, "Oh, how do you do X, Y, Z?" And it's such a technical question that I sometimes just don't know the answer to that, right? And I think that's just a myth that we know everything. We know a lot, but we don't know everything. And then lastly, to become a Salesforce architect, I first work as a Salesforce developer. Again, I don't think that is a necessary step. As I mentioned, if you're migrating from a different domain into a Salesforce architect role, I think you bring a lot of experience. If you have never worked in IT and you want to become an architect, you probably do need some experience as a developer, as a consultant, in order to get the understanding of how Salesforce works and how it hangs together, how to do workshops, and so on and so forth. So you are a developer, and I hope many of you that are on this call today are developers. And you are on this journey on wanting to become an architect. And again, when I say you're on this journey of wanting to become an architect, I'm not talking about your journey to become a system or application architect from a certification level or CTA. I'm talking about becoming an architect, which means to me something different, right? That means to me that you have the experience and the knowledge to perform well in this role and to be successful. Because there's nothing worse than having the greatest title in the world, but you can't live up to it. And for that reason, I've come up with these 9 considerations that I believe are important if you're on this journey on becoming an architect. And I think what I hope is that those 9 considerations will help you to evaluate where am I today and what's my journey here. So first of all, becoming an architect shouldn't be the end goal, right? If you said, I want to become an architect, then my next question would be, okay, once you reach this, what's happening after, right? Because it's not like that you suddenly become an architect and then all the learning stops, right? It's a progressive journey where, yes, you learn more and more and more and more, but then you reach this goal and the learning just continues, right? Like, since from the day I started my first role as a Salesforce architect until today, there has been so much more learning and experience in my journey that made me to the person that I am today, right? And I think it is important that you always keep setting goals and you always think about the goal after the one that you've just set, right? For me, it was, okay, I become an architect, and I knew when I become an architect, I'll do the CTA, right? Just to give you an idea. So it is lifelong learning, practicing, and practicing, right? So like, it's once you've become an architect and then you stop working as an architect and you're just, I don't know, managing a team of developers, but you're not hands-on anymore, you will start losing your skill set. You will, your learning curve will slow down. So be mindful of those impacts. And my tip here is really, always think about what happens when you reach your goal, right? Think about setting the next goal. Number 2, knowledge gets you started. Experience is what creates success, right? I truly believe that in order to be successful in something, you first need to learn about it, right? And to have a starting point. And I think if you can go through Trailhead, that gives you a lot of the learnings, right? It gives you some light hands-on experience, maybe through some badges that have some hands-on exercises with it. But the real experience happens if you work with a customer, with an end user, and you're actually implementing it based on business requirements that are presented to you, right? The one thing that nobody ever talks, or that nobody talks about in books, right, are mistakes, war stories, right? Ideas from colleagues that have maybe ran into the issue, learnings that some of the customers can tell you, right? And it's fully understandable that you will not be able to get experience in every single area, right? But I don't think that study of all areas will teach you enough. So you somehow need to fill this delta between what you can read and how to get the experience by learning from others. And I think learning from your peers, learning from your customers, and taking that on in your study journey is incredibly important, and it really helps you to accelerate that learning journey, experience journey. And my tip is, look, don't be afraid to make a mistake, right? You learn so much faster when you make a mistake. And that mistake could be that you made the wrong choice for an integration pattern, and it takes you the entire night to clean this up to implement the right integration pattern, right? It's really painful to be under pressure, trying to fix it, and making sure that it works afterwards. But you, after that experience, you will never make that mistake again. So keep that in mind. Number 3, can you list options? And that's now when we really start to talk about architect thinking. So as a developer, you get a business requirement and you execute, right? You get it to work. You might think about designing your code and building a pattern and yada, yada. As an architect, you still get a business problem, but you're not just asking yourself the question, how do I code this? You actually need to ask yourself the question, how can I solve this problem? And what are the different ways, right? And on that note, like you know, a custom UI is not always needed. And And also using clicks over code does not always work, right? So it's really a balance, and you need to be able to find the right solution. On that note, it's not clicks or code, it's clicks and code in my eyes, because quite simply, not everything can be solved using clicks. Or sometimes something that you solve with clicks does not perform well. Think about inserting 50,000 records overnight in a batch job and then having a process builder off the back of those records, right? There's some amazing performance implications that you will run into. So certainly keep that in mind, that options are very important. Now, my tip is that if you are starting to think more as an architect, whenever you get a problem, think about at least 3 different ways to solve this problem. And the hardest part is write it down, and write them down without any bias. Because as soon as you have bias, you will write down the option in a way that it's favorable for one of them. And the way how I normally document this, again, as an architect, is that I create a very simple table that says, okay, option 1, here are the pros, here are the cons. Option 2, pros and cons. Option 3, pros and cons, right? And purely just think about, okay, what's the benefit of doing this? What is the downside? Benefit is easy to maintain. Downside is hard on performance, right? Or it could be hard to maintain, but excellent reusability. So, and list all of those options before you start evaluating. And that leads us to consideration 4. Can you evaluate your options? So let's say you have written down the advantages and disadvantages in how you will solve a specific problem, right? What's over-engineered? Can you articulate what is actually over-engineered versus what is a long-term scalable solution, right? You could argue that writing a complex call-out framework that orchestrates call-outs to external systems and code is over-engineered if you just have one external integration. However, if you know as an architect that there are 10 integrations down the track, then I would say that's long-term scalable, right? Yes, we've done the work just now, and we know that's only relevant. We only have one integration in scope maybe for this project, but we know the customer wants down the track in phase 2, 3, they want to make sure that they integrate with 10 other systems. In that scenario, we would immediately say, hey, your call-out framework was a fantastic idea, right? So it's important that you think about not just about how do I solve this problem right now, but also how do I solve, what's the impact of this problem for the long term. Again, first of all, list your pros and cons, and then determine the impact, right, for each option before you make a recommendation. And that's for me the key thing. As an architect, you gotta have to make a recommendation. And those recommendations get easier over time. Once you've made the mistakes and you sort of like learn from your mistakes, the recommendations get easier, right? Where you realize, oh, no, this doesn't perform well under large data volumes. This has an impact on sharing. This will be hard from a master data management perspective. So, however, as an architect, you always got to have to make sure you think about making a recommendation off the back of your options, right? And I hope this tool set helps, because it's quite simple. You're a developer, you want to become an architect, just think about, okay, here's my problem. I list 3 options at least. I write pros and cons for each option, and then I make a recommendation based on the assessment that I've done. What else is there? Well, can you justify your decision, right? And again, I've spoken about it already, right? But you gotta have to be able to justify why you have why you're recommending a specific solution. And it's not enough just to say, oh, just look at the pros in my in my options evaluation. I actually need you to be able to say, hey, this has the benefit of long-term scalability, of maintainability, of low level of technical debt, of easy to deploy, of highly scalable, highly extendable, right? You need to be able to articulate that to me, and you need to be able to articulate to me why this option is better than the others. Okay. Again, like in that options sheet that you're creating, make sure you articulate how your choice fits into the customer's environment and how it helps them. Because in a laboratory, we can make tests that are quite sterile, right? But in a customer environment, there's a whole bunch of stuff that does not always make sense and it's not always in line with great enterprise architecture. There might be 3 databases that all store a bit of customer information, and the business has decided to keep those databases, right? Even though we would think naturally, let's consolidate them into one. There's surely a reason why they're not doing it. So you need to make sure that when you do your recommendations on what choice you should move ahead with, that it actually considers the environment of the customer. And again, that's a very important skill of an architect, to make sure that you think about in the wider enterprise architecture landscape and how your solution fits into the wider picture. Consideration number 6, standards versus patterns, right? So development standards, as we know, create consistency. And I'm German, so I love consistency, right? And I think it's very important to have documented standards that say, here's how we should always name our classes. Here's how we should name our process builders. Here's when we should use process builders versus Apex, etc. However, patterns are generic, right? Patterns take advantage of those development standards and then create reusable designs that that solve common problems. Think about things like, from a developer perspective, you would think about an error logging framework. I'm sure every developer out there has written once in their lifetime a logging framework to handle exceptions that are thrown by the code. To me, that's a framework that you've just built, right? And depending on how you've built this, it will certainly be reusable because it solves common problems, but it also could take advantage of some standard patterns, dependency injection, and so on and so forth, right? So make sure that when that you're aware of what you're using already, right? Surely you've used the trigger framework in the past, etc. But then as an architect, you're gonna have to go beyond that, right? You need to stop thinking just about how do I handle problems that happen within my code and within my Salesforce instance. And as an architect, you think more around, is it a monolithic application that I'm building? Is my single page application component based? Have I deconstructed the components in enough ways that it allows me to integrate external stuff? Can I take advantage of microservices to be more scalable than peak times when performance is needed, etc. Right? So keep that in mind. Number 6, and a lot of people struggle with this, especially developers that have been writing code for a long time and haven't really been much in customer workshops, right? As an architect, it's the number 1 thing you gotta have to know, right? On top of your knowledge, let's say the knowledge we take this for granted, but as an architect, I fully expect architects to be able to be in front of a customer and really run a workshop that engages the audience, that makes sure the audience stays on topic. You get the decisions that you want to have, and you also provide the advice. So it's a very, very hard thing to be good at, right? Because you're juggling so many things at the same time of managing expectations versus getting the information that you need. And this is one of the areas where I think training is just the key answer to be successful in this, right? The more often you run a workshop, the better you will get. It will be pretty painful in the beginning if you're not naturally great at that. But the more you do it, the better you get. And by the way, a lot of the candidates I coach from the CTA perspective, a lot of them say, oh, look, I have really this problem with presentation. And my response to that is always pretty much the same: practice, right? And this is exactly the tip that I'm giving here. Take every opportunity that you can to practice and overcome your fears. It could be to speak at Virtual Dreaming. It could be at putting in a submission for TDX, for Dreamforce, your local developer user group, right? I'm lucky enough to be leading the Sydney developers group. If somebody wants to give a presentation to practice their presentation skills, we're more than happy to entertain that and to help and coach them as well, right? So I certainly encourage everybody to put up their hand and present on something. And it could be simple. You might have built a fantastic Lightning component that takes 10 minutes to present. Go for it. Present it in the developer group, right? Other developers will be grateful for learning from you. If the other things like Toastmasters, right, which are really courses that help you with public speaking, etc. And then lastly, just seek the opportunity. So if your organization that you work for or work with gives you the opportunity of running a workshop, maybe take the opportunity, right? And get in there. Make sure you come prepared. If you are running it for the first time, I, for example, would create a slide deck that just writes down all the questions you want to have answered, right? That gives you guidance as you go through the workshop to say, okay, now let's talk about this epic. And here are all the questions I need to have answered. And here's what I'm thinking. Does that make sense? Can I validate that with you? Have I understood you correctly? Yes, I have. All of those areas are extremely important, okay? Consideration number 8, give yourself an honest assessment, right? I think some people that I work with, I find that they are significantly better than in what they do than they believe they are. But it also happens the other way around, right? So I think it's really important to make sure that you do a gap assessment, right? Understand where are you at? How do you compare with your skill set, your experience to other people that are at your level, one above, one below, right? Make sure you complete a gap assessment to really get an understanding for that, right? And one of those things is that I'd like to say is like that you shouldn't underestimate the fact that you don't know what you don't know, right? It's really hard if there is an area that you've never heard of and you don't know that it even exists, right? Because then that can very quickly create a trap. And when I prepared for my CTA, I certainly wanted to make sure I have a gap assessment done on all my Salesforce knowledge. And the way how I did that was by going into the setup menu of Salesforce. I expanded every single item that is in the menu, and I looked at every single item. And if I didn't know immediately what it was, that came onto my study list, right? And then a good example that I'd like to use is certificates. I know what a certificate is. I know that I can use it in authentication. But what I wasn't able to answer was, what's a public key? What's a private key? What's the difference between a self-signed and CA-signed certificate? How does the exchange happen, right? How does the validation happening? What's the how do I establish trust? All those areas were areas that I needed to dive into. And I think make sure that you do a gap assessment, and the way how you find out where the gaps are is totally up to you. One other area here is just to find a mentor. So like, I find always that if there's somebody that you trust and that you can learn from, go up to them and say, hey, look, I would love to get an assessment from you and understand and get your view on where I'm at, right? So like, find a mentor. Again, in order to do a gap assessment for yourself, list the key architect skills, give yourself a rating of 1 to 5, right? And make sure when you give yourself that rating, take into consideration knowledge and experience. And that can form a pretty good baseline. You might have a few areas where you go 5, 5, 5, 5. And then I would go to somebody and say, hey, look, I think I'm pretty good at this, right? Can you ask me a few questions? And then see how you go with that, right? If it's a 1, that's probably a pretty clear study plan candidate. And that brings us to the last consideration. I think setting a goal is important, but a goal without a plan is just a wish, right? So you gotta have to create a plan in order to achieve that. And I think some of the bits that you can do is you can first of all write down how you will gain the experience and how you will close the knowledge gaps, right? Once you've identified where's the gap, write down what are now the exact actions that you need to perform. Seek opportunities. So actively look at public speaking if that's something that you need to improve. Or if there is, I know you've never implemented Salesforce Service Cloud, make sure you find an opportunity that enables you to get experience on that. Ideally, where you work under somebody else that has a lot of experience in it that you can learn from. Put your hand up to write documentation. Everybody hates writing documentation, or at least I don't know anyone that loves it. But it just gives you a very good learning exercise on fully understanding it, right? If you can write it down in your own words and you can even articulate it and speak about it, I think then you really understood the problem and you understood the solution, right? So I think put up your hand for that kind of stuff. And then this is not a race, it's a marathon. Everybody keeps saying that, but give yourself time, right? There's no point in saying, in 1 year, I need to be an architect, if that's just not realistic, right? Sometimes it takes 3-4 years to become an architect, but then you are a good architect. Hence, yeah, don't rush into this if you're not ready. Again, from my side, I think in terms of tips, I would suggest put dates on activities to hold yourself accountable, right? If you just set a goal and you create a study plan, but then you don't follow up with it, that's going to be really challenging to achieve, right? So if you set some dates, that certainly helps to make sure that you work towards something. Then also challenge yourself, right? If you're in your day-to-day job and you've put a specific solution forward, challenge yourself and ask yourself, was that the right solution that I put forward and why was it the right solution? If you can articulate the why, that's a very good sign. And where does that leave us with, right? What's next? So I hope those nine points were helpful, but really what you can do next is find a mentor or somebody you can learn from, right? I think it just helps to accelerate your journey. Create your goal. I want to be X in N number of month, days, weeks, whatever your unit is of time, right? So set that goal and then assess your gaps, right? Make sure you consider knowledge and experience. And then you work backwards from your goal, right? If you say in 1.5 years time, I want to be an architect, and that architect, your acceptance criteria for that is, yes, you've passed system and application architect at Salesforce, but you've also had 3 projects where you were the, I don't know, maybe architect under another architect first, and then you were the leading architect of the implementation, and a 3rd time just to practice, right? If that might be your goal, now you can go ahead, you can work backwards and say, hey, in order to achieve this, what do I need to do? And then you go out and actively seek the opportunities for that to make sure that you close those gaps to be successful. And then track your progress and adjust accordingly. It's totally okay to come to the realization that you're going slower or faster. That's totally fine, right? Great, just adjust, right? Run it agile. If you realize that life gets in the way, and that's totally okay, just adjust your plans. Don't be rushing into it. Make sure you do it properly. And with that, I will look at a few questions and hope that there was valuable information in here. And I'll just jump over to the questions and start answering a few. I won't answer all of them because that's probably we're probably running out of time. So somebody's asking, would you agree that a CTA is more alike to enterprise architect than to technical expert? Yes, however, a CTA is a Salesforce-centric architect, right? We know Salesforce extremely well. The CTA exam is not testing us on other technologies that are not provided by Salesforce. But certainly we're looking more at an enterprise architecture level than a technical technical expert level. Let me jump through the next one. Just trying to find one. How do you keep yourself updated with all the changes in Salesforce? Trailhead, blocks, release notes, question mark. Amazing question, right? Because Salesforce obviously keeps innovating so fast, it's really hard to stay up to date. I think release notes is just helping you to stay up to date. Trailhead, fantastic learning platform. Hands-on. again, like for my CTA preparation, I think I've built pretty much everything you can build in Salesforce, right? I've set up everything from single sign-on, social sign-on, files connect, all sorts of different integrations, all sorts of sharing features that you can have in Salesforce. Even the little weird odd things, right? Like how to use Pricebook and set sharing on Pricebooks and products. I mean, all that kind of stuff. Hands-on experience is just one of the most important things. Moving on, once an architect take the decision, can a developer question it? Absolutely, yes, please, right? Like, I think as an architect, if somebody else has a better idea on how to solve a problem, and that developer has a good suggestion or questions the decision that I'm making, 100%, because look, we're working towards the same goal, right? Like, I'd be grateful if somebody will will challenge me, right? Because if somebody challenges me and I'm able to articulate why I think it's the right way to go, that's great. And if we're in a disagreement, then we need to make sure we find agreement. Cool. If an architect doesn't know coding, how can he suggest on the design patterns? Yeah, good question. Look, I don't expect an architect to suggest to you, should you use a singleton or dependency injection or the build pattern, right? Like, I don't expect an architect to do that. I think as an architect, I expect somebody to say, hey, look, I know there will be 3 integrations. Can we make sure we build a framework that is usable so we don't hard code 3 times the HTTP call out, and the handling of the response, can we somehow make this generic? And then I want to trust the developer that they're gonna do it. Cool, next question. I'll do this and one more. Any good books or documents talking about best standards and patterns? Yes, heaps, right? I believe Jitendra, who's on the call, even wrote a book about that for Salesforce. And there are tons of good books out there, right? If you're looking at coding patterns, the Gang of Four, sort of like the Bible for a lot of developers. What I said in a presentation that I did earlier today already was I'll follow up with a blog post on LinkedIn where I share a few resources that I recommend. Yeah, so feel free to follow me on LinkedIn for that. Last question. In real time, what is the real, I guess, responsibility of a system architect versus enterprise architect? Okay, great question. Enterprise architect within an organization would not necessarily know Salesforce very well. However, a system architect will, right? And as a system architect, and I'm talking about a Salesforce system architect here, you would certainly understand very well the different mechanisms of authentication, authorization, integration with the Salesforce platform, and the best patterns to do so. Versus an enterprise architect would probably worry more about how do we orchestrate the interconnection between different systems to achieve a wider goal. And I think with that, I will leave it here and thank everybody for joining.
We were just a bunch of nerdy kids who ignored the haters. We took their ridicule and we built on it. And when some of us gave up, well, we built on that too. Built resilience, built on a mission to make things a little better every day until the users came. Then the haters were VCs who scoffed at our audacity. This just isn't the way things are done. But we kept building. Users turned into teams, turned into companies, running their entire businesses on our apps. Then the software giants came after us. We weren't proven, we weren't fully featured, our radical cloud model wasn't secure. But we built on. And today, as companies adopt the cloud to move faster, teams are finding themselves slowed down by each other's efforts. The skeptics are claiming we'll never develop innovation at scale. But now, DevOps have come to the cloud, ushering in a new era of transformation. Companies can release on demand across hundreds of environments, innovating faster with fewer conflicts and fewer disruptions. There will always be challenges. There will always be naysayers. And we'll build on.